There you go.
Okay. Thank you, Heather. Thanks for inviting me to come here and represent some prescribed fire research today. So I did introduce myself already quickly, but I thought I would provide a couple of more pieces of information. So I am one of the members of the advisory board, and my role is to help represent research and also to serve as a liaison between the training programs and education programs that we have for future fire use professionals, and then the research community as a whole. So I've been involved in fire research for about 20 years now. The first bird that I ever did was in California, believe it or not. It's probably the last bird in California. But it was in 1996, I think, and I got to use the Paratorch. I was glad to see that today. That's what really got me hooked on fire. So that's when I got into fire, started on a fire crew for a short time, and then went into my master's degree and my PhD, also in California at Berkeley. And I've always been really interested in prescribed fire use and field treatments and how to evaluate their effectiveness and how to use them for ecological benefits. So I was at the University of Florida for 10 years before I came here to the University of Idaho. And I served on the prescribed fire, the North Florida Prescribed Fire Council Advisory Board for about that whole time as well. So in Florida, there are 3 prescribed fire councils. And I think this one is growing probably as fast as the North Florida Prescribed Fire Council grew. So it's very exciting to see. I've done a lot of work teaching, like I mentioned, teaching students how to use prescribed fire. That's as extensive as our PPE was during those days, where we would burn every Friday at the school. And we got probably about 3,000 acres done every spring semester. So a little bit of actual accomplishment there. But since I've come to the University of Idaho, I've been really focused on leading what we have here called the Master of Natural Resources program. And that program has a number of different specializations in it. One of them is fire ecology. We have about 200 students every semester in the program. And I think in terms of how many we've graduated in the fire ecology and management specialization of the MR, it's somewhere around 50 students that we've graduated. Every fire that I go on for research, I've met one of my students that I've worked with. So it's really neat, the kind of, broad impact that I think our training programs and our education programs are having on people who are using fire out in the world, all across the country. Like I said, my research has always focused on field treatments, fire management related to prescribed fire. And then recently I've been very interested in the actual living part of smoke. And that's what I focused my research program on since then. So I use drones that go to wildfires and prescribed fires alike and capture organisms that are living in the smoke. And it turns out that these things are being transported through smoke, and they land back on communities and repopulate the soils in those communities. So we can even think about smoke as being like a temporary refuge for beneficial organisms that then land and recolonize soils that have been disturbed. So some really neat stuff that that we've been working on in my lab group related to fire biology. But what I'm going to focus on today to share with all of you is not anything really related to my research. So I'm going to do my best to represent some research that has come out in the last year, mostly in the last year, that provide kind of 3 different lines of evidence that are, I think, supportive for prescribed fire use. So the first one is going to be about historical context. The second is going to be about perceptions and experiences of wildfire and prescribed fire smoke. And that one is really going to have some results that surprise you. They really surprised me, and I thought were really exciting. And then to maybe prime us for what we're going to talk about this afternoon, I think Lucas is the person who's going to talk about the prescribed burn associations. I'll just cover a study that just came out, I think, a week ago that he was probably involved in. Maybe we'll hear about that. So I think these are the kinds of things that represent the way that fire may be perceived by the public at large. These are the messages that I think people get more often than any other messages about fire from the media. So if you get things like this, it's a little bit of, I think, in a cognitive discord to think about then promoting prescribed fire use. So how do you take perspectives like this and all of these things that are happening with wildfire and then succinctly communicate to the public why more fire is the best idea? And I imagine that's something that everyone in this room has grappled with. Is that the case? Is that kind of communication about why we support prescribed fire when all of this is happening? It's hard to do. Well, one line of evidence that I think can be very effective is to highlight what the historical context is of fire on our landscape. So what are the norms? What is the truth of the land that is promoting fire? How is it part of what our natural landscape is? How is it that we are in fire's habitat versus vice versa? So a study that just came out a couple of weeks ago in Nature Communications, so this is, of course, meant to reach a really broad audience, was an actual redo of a study that was done in 2015. So that's why the word persists is in there, because this work had originally been published in 2015, a very similar analysis. And basically what they did was use the American Tree Ring Fire Scar Network. So a network of all of the fire scars and the data that comes with fire scar analysis that documents historical rates of fire occurrence in different locations. They took all of that information and compared what the patterns looked like pre-1880 versus what they're calling contemporary era, which is 1984 to 2022. And their overall summation is that despite increasing area burned in recent decades, widespread fire deficit persists across a range of forest types. So that can be certainly, I think, communicated as a reason for supporting increased use of fire. To understand that in comparison to that historical era, even though things are different because of climate change, et cetera, that there is a really good reason to understand that the ecosystems that are evolved to be perpetuated with a particular fire return interval could not be perpetuated without that fire, that they depend on fire. So in the two areas that are represented in Idaho, they categorize like the Great Basin as North American deserts and the Northwest Forested Mountains. So in the Northwest Forested Mountains, 19% of, is there a laser on here?
It doesn't work on the screen.
Okay. 19% of what would be expected is burning now, and 21% of what would be expected based on that historical fire record is burning now. So those are pretty low percentages. So that's how they indicate the fire deficit. They also looked at specific years where there were very high areas represented by being burned. And they found that even in these recently high record years, like 2022, only about 6% of the sites that they have fire scar record data for actually burned. And that's equal to about the historical average. So in comparison, that's far below the maximum numbers, which I wonder if you might know that, because I don't remember exactly what percentage that was. Thank you. Maximum of 29% burned in 1748. So a widespread big fire year in 1748 would have burned 28% of the land, 29% of the land, versus our widespread big fire year 2020 burning 6% of the land. Does that make sense? That comparison? Now feel free to jump in with questions.
And that's percent, that's acres, right?
This is based on acres.
Yeah, so not biomass or, you know, fire severity, it's not.
No, but that's a great question. Yeah. So like, this is just the amount of space that burns. Right. So, and it's not even necessarily exactly that, because they're using fire scar records. And you have to make a lot of assumptions, like this one tree that is scarred 15 times represents an area that is probably, based on this ecosystem type, 200 acres that burn. So there are definitely a lot of assumptions there. But I love that you bring this point up, because the details really matter, right? Like, what kind of fire are we talking about? And has that changed? So this is actually a study that goes back to 2019. So doesn't fit the 2025 criteria, but I thought it was really important because I hoped that somebody would ask that type of question. So what type of fire is actually most missing? So in this study, they actually used the historical fire return interval. So the historical mean of the number of years between fires for a given ecosystem type. And they categorize this for the Pacific Northwest region, which includes some of our region in the Columbia Mountains and the Columbia Plateau, but a lot of similar fire regime types that were included. And so what they found was that overall, in lower severity fire regimes, so those are fire return intervals of less than 35 years, so fire occurring every less than 35 years on average, less than 3% of the study area that would have been expected to burn based on that fire return interval actually burned. So the amount that would have been expected to burn in that category was 7 to 10 million hectares. So obviously a lot less than what we are seeing in that low severity category. So onto just, I think the only graph or figure that I'm going to show you with data on it. So I want to start by orienting you. The proportion of fire is on the x-axis. So there are 3 different sections. And here's looking at that nuance, fire severity low versus moderate versus high. And the blue lines that look like little TIE fighters, those are the expected range based on historical data. And then the orangish yellow ones are the actual observations based on that 1984 to 2020 time period. So as you can see, across the regions that they looked at, and ours would probably be the Columbia Northern Rockies region. What we see is that the expected range is far higher than the observed range. So low severity fire in the low severity fire regime type is at a deficit. In comparison, so you can see that those are kind of flipped in the high severity range. So high severity fire is overrepresented in comparison to the historical mean. If we go into mixed fire regimes, so mixed severity fire regimes, there's a little bit more closer relationship between what we expect to see historically and what we see. And then as we go into the high severity, we see again that there is a mismatch. If you look at this panel, in almost all of the parts of the Pacific Northwest regions that they looked at, the expected range is higher than what is observed. So high severity fire missing in high severity fire regimes, low severity fire missing in low severity fire regimes, and overrepresented in the low severity fire regimes are overrepresented with regards to high severity fire. Does that make sense so far? Okay. So I think the evidence, is important. It's an important and hopefully effective way to communicate with the public to understand, that even though what we're seeing now is severe and destructive, that it's a nuanced question, but the particular historical fire regimes that we expect to perpetuate the ecosystems that we want to perpetuate are in many cases at a deficit of the right type of fire for those ecosystems. So I know I didn't communicate that very well, but people who have that responsibility for communicating that message in a succinct way, I think that this kind of study and this kind of data could be useful. So the part about low severity fires, I think all of us are very comfortable, at least myself in my experience as a prescribed burn manager, and I'm much more comfortable prescribing low severity burns. It's certainly a lot easier to do. But a lot of the work that I do actually does focus on high severity prescribed fires, which are being done throughout the Rockies, especially in places like the Fish Lake National Forest in Utah is a great example of using high severity prescribed fire to perpetuate aspen, regenerate aspen systems. But it's definitely more of a challenge. And so I did say that I was not gonna focus on my research, but I wanted to share just one example of a paper that we put together last year. And this was led by a Forest Service researcher, Malcolm North. And what we tried to evaluate is what could we do with the opportunities of using fire more effectively, not just prescribed low severity fires, but taking advantage of lightning ignitions And identifying places where it would be safe for lightning ignitions to do ecological work. So, for example, for Idaho, out of almost 2 million hectares, and we only focused on frequent fire forests, but out of about 2 million hectares of frequent fire forests on federal lands specifically, if we applied a 2,400 meter buffer around any property for wildland urban interface, about 378,000 hectares would be potentially available to be considered in what we're calling strategic fire zones. That could be a place where prescribed fire, cultural fire, or lightning ignited ecological wildfire can be used. If we change that patch size, so we provided this information across 11 different states in the US, where these kind of high severity potential fires could be applied or could be integrated in a frequent fire system, potentially including some areas with high severity fires. So with a bigger patch of 2,000 hectares, about 500,000 hectares would qualify as what we're calling a strategic fire zone. Is this a concept that has come across people's plates? I'm sure it has with everyone who has probably used wildfires effectively. Is that something that anybody has experienced?
I've heard of like the pods. I think it's preliminary.
Potential operations.
Potential
Yeah.
operations.
So
Yeah,
I've actually been on managed fires in the Southern Rockies where they utilized basically what you're talking about, predetermined strategies to turn a single tree fire into like that 5,000 acre managed wildfire.
yeah, awesome. So the way that that these SFZs are defined is in relation to pods. Yeah, so how would these lands overlap pods, or how would they be integrated into the pods? So that operationally, it's additive and not an extra layer of complication, but an identification of lands that could be potentially burned more effectively, because as we know, scaling up is one of the biggest challenges in fire use and getting fire back on our landscape effectively. Okay, so I would call that study good news for prescribed fire and as well for strategic wildfire use. Okay, so the second one that I had mentioned earlier, perceptions of wildfire smoke. So this study asked the questions: does perceived risk of smoke exposure relationship between recent smoke experience and support for prescribed burning? And does the previous experience of wildfire smoke affect support for prescribed fire, even if this is smoke that is in your backyard or prescribed fire in your backyard? Is that a question that you all have had? It certainly is one that I have had. How much is people's experience of smoke affecting their willingness to tolerate smoke from prescribed fires? Huge, important question. So I love that this research was done. So the way that they did it, they conducted an online survey and they reiterated the survey requests until they had a minimum number of respondents. So this is a really, really solid showing in terms of the number of participants in this study. They focused on EPA regions 8, 9, and 10, and waited until they had 400 and 900 responses from the different regions. So a total of almost 2,000 people responded to this. So really, really good, solid study. So in general, with regards to the support for prescribed fire, 75% of the population supported prescribed fire in general. I think that's a pretty big change in the last 10 years. So I think probably everyone in this room has been doing an amazing job at contributing to that being the case. 50%, more than 50% even supported prescribed fire in their own neighborhood, in their backyards, which is also, I think, a pretty significant change in the last 10 years. So how does experience of smoke affect the support? 44% reported experiencing a smoke event in the last 3 years, so it's pretty high, which actually, this is the big surprising result increased the odds of support for prescribed burning. So 2 times as likely to support prescribed burning if they had experienced smoke. And this is controlling for whether they're in the WUI, not in the WUI. All the demographic factors were accounted for. None of those things seem to matter. This was a solid finding that people who had experienced wildfire smoke were in greater support of prescribed fire. So I think that's a huge accomplishment. I mean, I think what that means is that the public has really come to understand what it means to use prescribed fire and are willing to tolerate the smoke that is associated with it. At least that's kind of my take home message. How about risk perception and how that affects things going into the future? So risk perception, a higher perceived risk of future smoke impacts actually led to an increased support for prescribed fire. So even if people were concerned about the effects on, and they looked at a number of different factors like exercising outdoors, working outside, health impacts, visibility, they asked questions about all of these things. All put together, it increased the support for prescribed fire. 1.66 means about 66% increase, 1.72 increase in odds ratio, about 72% increase in support for prescribed fire near their residence, so in their backyards, if they have a higher perceived risk of future smoke impacts. So that's also, I think, a really surprising finding. Any questions about those? Does that strike any of you as surprising like it did me?
I'm surprised, particularly by the second one for sure, that, you know, that their previous experience was not. That didn't paint a large enough negative picture for them to not support prescribed fire. Like, I just would have assumed that that would have affected their perception moving down the road. But everything else, like the TNC did the Nature Conservancy did a survey in North Idaho a few years, maybe 5 years ago, 4 years ago. And we found relatively high broad support across the political spectrum for prescribed fire. And so that the other part really just reinforced that survey.
I guess it definitely makes me wonder what things would look like in other EPA regions. You know, especially because probably education on prescribed fire, outreach on prescribed fire, like let's say in the Northeast, for example. You know, for many people, their first experience of smoke happened just 2 years ago. And whether they have the same understanding of prescribed fire and what it means for smoke in relation to the smoke that they experience. Yeah, I'm really curious to see what that would look like.
I started to become suspicious of my perceptions of people's perceptions after reading some of Sarah McCaffrey's work. And so a lot of her work points out that sometimes it's not a perception of the public's issue, it's a perception of the perceptions of the public's issue. And so that just makes me not trust again, my gut instinct would be like, wow, that's not like it. But I think I'm clearly not always right about that, so which is good.
Yeah, I think it's always important to go to the source because we're all biased in our own ways. When I was in Florida and got to burn at the University of Florida campus in the town of Gainesville, in the middle of the town on a 40-acre unit, and the public would come by and, you know, ask what we were doing. Never did anyone express a lack of support. I mean, it was just amazing. And that, I think being in the South for a while really changed my perspective on what the public can tolerate in terms of smoke from prescribed fire. They were all for it. They said, oh, we'll just reduce the risk of wildfire, you know, when lightning season starts, before it starts to rain. I said, yeah, probably will. And they're like, okay, go for it. You know, keep lighting, can I participate? So, okay, good news for prescribed fire. All right, the last one I wanted to talk about is prescribed burn associations. This is really quick because I know you'll hear a lot more about this from a real expert on PBAs later today. But there was some work that was done to sort of summarize where we are right now as a country with regards to PBAs. And you can see the distribution of PBAs across the country. In the West, they contacted 33 leaders of PBAs and had a response rate of 21. In the Great Plains, contacted 70, had a response rate of 30. So you can see those R's are response rates for this particular survey. When they put the results together, asked everybody how much burning they're doing, accomplishing through the PBAs. They got to about 34,000 hectares per year across the US. That's being conducted by PBAs and accomplished on private lands. In terms of differences amongst the regions, so first, on average, about 50 burns per year across the regions. I'm sorry, on average, 10 burns per year across the regions, max of 50. In the Southeast, it had the highest mean of almost 20 and a max of 50. In the Great Plains, a mean of just under 9 and a max of 30 versus Northeast, a mean of 10, and Western regions, a mean of 5 burns per year. So certainly a longer history of prescribed burn associations being in place and affecting the number of burns that get accomplished in the Southeast versus other regions, especially in the West. So all of them had different types of requirements to participate in a burn on someone else's property. And I think this is really of interest, because if we think about PBAs as a way to enable the use of fire, especially on private lands, then we need to consider that, you know, the things that we all came up with in terms of, or at least many of us came up with in terms of training in the federal system and getting your quals, et cetera, don't really apply for this kind of burning, or don't, you know, I think they need to be evaluated how well and which ones should apply to burning on private lands, if any. So it's kind of a different way of thinking about fire. Only 45% actually required PPE. Liability waiver, only 37%. You don't necessarily have to be a PBA member. Only 19% required any previous training or qualifications. So that means people can walk up and participate in the burn, in these types of burns. And age-based restrictions, only 11%. So, you know, this is where you get all of the heartwarming, at least to me, photos like this one here of kids learning how to use prescribed fire effectively and safely as a management tool on their private lands. In terms of their perceived impacts on the goals that the PBAs have, these were also kind of all over the place, not super consistent. The one that would be the highest with regards to either very or extremely perceived success being accomplished would be providing tools and equipment for burns. So that area, I think, has been most, at least according to these PBAs that were questioned, that has been considered to be maybe the biggest or most consistent benefit of the PBAs. And some of those others, like I said, were a little bit mixed in those responses. But their summary was that the rise of PBAs in the US is a testament to the appetite for rekindled connection with fire, and that these have increased over the past 4 decades and are continuing to grow nationally. And we'll hear more about that later. But this is kind of a nice benchmark to see where we are now. And, you know, who knows, maybe in the next couple of years, this is going to be very different, especially as private landowners become more engaged with prescribed fire use, especially in places like Idaho. Okay, that's all that I think I had to share with you today. And again, like I said, my role is also to act as a liaison if there are research questions that you have, or also to share any of these things, any of these studies with you. I can run out right now even and get copies of these papers and bring them back for the afternoon session if anybody had an interest. You can also contact me at any point to get copies of these or any other papers. So if you see a headline that says like this new research was done and you don't have access to those journals that cost tens of thousands of dollars to get access to, please feel free to reach out to me. That is one of my favorite things to do, is to share the wealth.
We'll post those particular articles along with this recorded presentation on the Idaho Prescribed Fire Council website after this meeting.
Okay, any questions? I know you all want lunch, so. The tough time slot you put me in. Heather.
I know.
This is what I get for being on your committee.
That's right. I think I would have been nicer to see you pass me.
Has there been any sort of research or correlation between effectiveness of outreach or education for communities before prescribed fire and then talking with dispatch? And just.
Oh, to see how many
Just
people
like,
called
how,
in.
yeah, like, was this outreach effective or not? Are you guys still getting 1 million calls?
Yeah.
What are the vibes? Are people panicking or are they just like, hey, wanna make sure you know? Cause I know around North Idaho, I think that there's been a huge shift over the last few years, as we all know. But I think some of the historical comfort and knowledge of, fire on the ground is, shifting, and folks who are moving here, even though they're moving from places where I think there's been a lot of good education about fire, is still, there is concern. And that's not a perception, that's an experience of being like screamed at to put, piles out. And I'm just curious if there's, what the effectiveness of outreach or how we can be more effective with our education and outreach before we fire on the ground.
I could speak a little bit to that.
Oh, yeah.
Just with what I'm starting to pull together with my research. So the 2 papers that I'll be working on next, one is about communication with private landowners and the people that work on those lands. And then the second is about the practices that these groups are currently doing with relation to prescribed fire and smoke management. And so as I'm looking into this communication idea, and reading papers that others have written in various states of like, how do we communicate with this population that is so diverse, so changing, so, those 2 things. So lots of different interests, lots of different ways to communicate. And so, one of the things that's found is that amongst some really rigorous studies, similar to what Lita presented here, with like really reaching out to lots of participants in this particular state was California. And they found that, that no group, so within there was CAL FIRE, there was extension, there was all these things. So no individual group was able to reach more than 30% of the population. So as much as you try, even like trying everything you can, you might only reach 30%. And then across the board, only 60% of the people that responded to this survey had ever felt that they had received information from any source. And so, and then in a state of Arkansas, like they've done a really big push with extension and on trying to get people involved in forest practices programs, because there's advantages to doing that when you've got all this forest land owned by families. If they can get them all board on best practices for forestry, then all of a sudden there's a whole more set of production. And only 5% of that group is like participating in those programs. And so to me, that's just evidence like this is really hard. And so it takes, I think that one of the things that we have done ourselves a disservice on in our field is we think that people will just come to us and want to know, but the process of communication is extremely labor intensive because it takes personal connection and getting to know people. And as it'd be fantastic if we could just print flyers, hand them out, send an email, put a web meeting on. But the truth is that to really make an impact, you have to actually like care about people. And you have to get to know them and hear what they care about and hear what they do. And connect what you're saying with what matters to them. The reason, like my study is funded by Idaho DEQ, because we want to know there's this population of people that are burning, and we don't know what they're doing with this, with like what practices they do. And so I'll present fully on that in the future. But one of the like preliminary just thoughts that's coming up is that people don't think that they are managing for smoke. They would verbally say, smoke management's not something that I'm considering, but then their practices actually are pretty decent. And so there's also this like mixed perception of like, I don't care about smoke, but I won't burn a green pile. That'd be ridiculous, too smoky, something. Right? So sometimes, we, in that case, like some future messaging recommendation that I would have would be like, don't call it smoke management, maybe, right? Like that's like get them to do the thing that we want them to do, but call it something that they would prefer to do as something. So like being able to pin the message around is really important, but ultimately, like, getting to know people, spending time with them, responding to what they care about is really an important part of that. It just takes a lot of time.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and the research that Heather's doing is gonna be really impactful, so maybe next
Yeah.
year you'll be
Next
good
year.
in.
Definitely.
Great.
Definitely.
The only thing I would add is that to support what you're saying is that there has been a lot of work in trying to understand the different types or the archetypes of people who are making decisions about, fuels management or hardening their homes or all of those things, or whether to support prescribed fire. And that, a lot of that work has been done actually out of the University of Idaho, and has included a lot of the Idaho population, so that work has been led by Travis Cavaglio. And I'd be happy to give you his name and contact
Yeah.
information. Maybe what I'll do is throw a couple papers into that shared portal, wherever we're gonna put the papers.
Mhm.
But I can also talk to you individually afterwards.
Yeah.
But yeah, knowing who the audience is.
Right.
is
Yeah,
incredibly
it's tough to
important.
be such broad audiences, if you think about it, doing some sort of, like, just small pile burns off Canfield last year, Gooding County Fire Smart led that hazardous fuel reduction project, and it was like, super effective, small piles, really well laid out, really well done, and there was still lots of outreach done, and still just folks were really concerned. And, just, how do we bridge that gap? And, it's always an educational opportunity. And once you get to talking to people, they want the same thing, but it's just a method of accomplishments. Everyone's got a different idea of how it should or shouldn't be done. And that's just, I think there's a lot of, it's just a constant conversation, a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, and I definitely was on Nextdoor during that time.
It was,
And it was amazing though how many people came to the defense of
Yeah.
prescribed burning, which was really cool.
absolutely.
And, the basic tagline was like, this is what we do in Idaho, this is what happens at this time of year. This smoke is gonna prevent smoke in the future, get with it. And that was incredible to see.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you, everybody.
Yeah,
Thanks, Leah.
Thank you.